Hello to both of you.
Hello, Darren.
Now, Peter, before we get on to statues, I want to ask you about the BBC proms uturn. Now, after massive public backlash, Land of Hope and Glory and Rule Britannia will now be sung in the Royal Albert Hall. Do you think this is a sign of the tide turning against the wokearati?
Uh, Short answer to that, Darren, is no. Um, I'm afraid. This is obviously encouraging to us, simply because it shows actually that what public pressure can do, is remarkable. And in fact, there was one national newspaper had a poll, a petition that they were putting forward. We put the pressure on as well, and of course, Lawrence Fox, it was great when he actually went ahead and managed to, get people to put Land of Hope and Glory at the top of the charts, iTunes charts. But we shouldn't really see this anything other than a false dawn. All we've had with the last night, and I'm very pleased about, very pleased. Don't get me wrong, is that basically something which I think is emblematic. This was emblematic. And I think wise the council prevailed, and possibly a bit of panic too. And they sort of thought, wait a minute, the tide, if you like, the tide is turning, not to contradict what I just said, but perhaps with the BBC, I think we are actually seeing something change quite fundamentally there. Because I think that I can remember before both of you were born, in the 1980s, BBC bias was all about Tory politicians, getting on the Today programme and saying, why do you not interview us as much as you interview Labour people? I think the difference now is that the majority of people realise that it's not just about news and interviews, that the kind of ideology of the BBC pervades everything. It pervades all its output. That, I think, people are far more aware of, which is good. A very good example, you were talking about slavery there, Emma, and I think it is not too implausible to suggest that, say, the BBC, for example, does these great adaptations of our classics on Sunday nights, and everyone loves them, and always did love them, and so they do Jane Austen and what have you. And I can sort of see a time where basically people are saying, well, wait a minute, take Pride and Prejudice, take these books, all the characters that we love, Mr. Darcy and all these people, well, they essentially, all of this lifestyle in these houses, it was all basically based, wasn't it, on slavery? I mean, and should we even really be celebrating, or should we be saying, should we be adapting these books? You can see how that would cross their mind. So before you know it, you stop having classic books being done. You start to have them with contextualizing forwards in them. And I mean, that is actually, I would say, also would have to be entirely resisted, because like the contextualizing plaques that we're seeing on statues, because it's like half the way there for them. I mean, it's like the door is ajar there, and I think you've absolutely got to be blanket saying no, like President Macron said about statues. For better or worse, these are the deeds of French history, and that is it.
Peter, speaking of rewriting history, can I just ask you about the British Library and the British Museum? Because, as we touched on, the British Museum has made statements about rewriting history, and the British Library's chief librarian has claimed that racism is a creation of white people, and then backed calls for major cultural change at the institution. That was according to the Telegraph. What do you think the thinking is behind this, and how can we challenge it? Is it just a case of we have to fight this with our wallets and just not go to these institutions? What can we do?
Absolutely, Darren. First of all, with those two institutions, and also I would say probably the British Library has the edge there, because to me, the British Library is sort of like the very spine, if you like, of our culture, and indeed not just British culture. It's not just the repository of all our cultural memories. It's also one of the bedrocks of Western civilization. The point is that these institutions, British Library, British Museum, most public institutions actually in Britain now, they now define themselves in terms of political objectives. So, for example, diversity and inclusion. These are the two: diversity and inclusion. Everything. If you ask what most public institutions are about now, or even for that matter, some private companies, they will sort of say, "Oh, it's diversity and inclusion." So, in fact, the actual function, what they're actually meant to be doing, suffers. Quite often, they're quite incompetent. They're very badly run. People don't understand what they're actually meant to be doing, because it's all about singing from the same ideological song sheet. I think that in terms of the British Library, they actually broke some of the rules of what they're actually meant to be doing in terms of suggesting that people support a political organization, in this case Black Lives Matter. And indeed, I think there were also calls, were there not, to support people like Diane Abbott's campaign about COVID and racism. And this is sort of not what they're meant to be doing at all. In answer to your question, it's not really down to us and our, if you like, our wallets in these cases. I'm afraid it's down to public money. Mm. And it comes actually to the point where, what do you do? You ask me, what do you do about this? Right. Well, you can try and win hearts and minds, and you can wait for generations, or you can actually say, we've got to take away, the 90 million that the British Library gets if they continue to do this. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, that leaves people like us in a bit of a bind, because we think the British Library is a magnificent institution. We think, so that the museum is too. We don't want to make these things impoverished in any way. But it might come to the point where the only way you can actually force change, and that same goes for the BBC, because when we talk about the license fee, we're talking about the same thing, is actually saying you're not getting this money anymore.
Yeah,
you've got to do what you're meant to do, otherwise you don't get it.
But there is this reluctance to listen to anyone that actually wants this nation to do well, and far too often do we hear the voices of those who actually think this nation is a racist backwater and we might as well just give up and go somewhere else. That United Kingdom means absolutely nothing as far as its history and what it stands for is concerned. How do you think actually we can change that as far as that infiltrating our culture is concerned?
I think obviously Douglas was entirely right. It's obvious that basically the people we're talking about, they don't wish the country well at all. They don't wish British history well. They don't wish Western civilization well. And essentially, it's a mixture, I think, of a sort of strange, it's self-loathing mixed with nihilism, because quite often these people don't actually believe in, anything else. They're not putting forward anything. We've even seen that, with many of the demonstrations. You ask actually, well, what do you want? Okay, with Black Lives Matter, it was a kind of rather crude form of Marxism that they were talking about, abolish the family, abolish the capitalist system. But I think that generally in our culture, I think the problem is this, Darren, really, is that for a long time, and I know this from my own conversations, that the Tory party thought that they mistook this kind of self-loathing for good old-fashioned British reticence, and sort of like almost a romantic type of idea. Oh, well, we don't do. I remember David Cameron saying back when he was Prime Minister, David Cameron, the original footnote in history, he said something like, we don't do flags, right? And I remember at the time thinking, well, actually, I think things have changed. We've got to do flags, right? But it was very much part of that sort of old-fashioned patrician Tory idea that there was something a bit below the salt about being very obviously patriotic. There was something rather distasteful about it. We didn't need to. And it was, I suppose, fair enough. It was based on a kind of sense of innate superiority, you might say. It was sort of based on a kind of imperial superiority. But anyway, that sort of attitude amongst many Tories is stuck. So, when you say to them and you explain, no, we're talking about people, whether it's in the teaching union or people who run the British Library or people at the BBC or in all of our broadcast media, they are never going to celebrate Britain because they don't like it. They don't like it. And they almost sort of like take a comfort, if you like. It seems odd, but they take a comfort in being opposed to it, and because it makes them feel superior as well.
Yeah.
And don't ever underestimate that. I think that when it comes to what we do, I would say that there is one way in which you could look at the situation at the moment, and if you're trying to be optimistic about it, this is one way. You could say that what we have been droning on about for years, all of us, and that is, the long march through the institutions, the takeover of the culture by people who hate it. Their hand is open now. We're seeing it all. It's no longer something we talk about that people say, no, what are you talking about? You're just paranoid. It's right there. They've made it quite clear. We know now who we're dealing with. There is something in that. That is useful. Even if it means that it's nasty for us and it's a battle for us, at least they're out in full view in many ways, right?
To close, I wonder if you might both reflect on how you think that the silent majority out there, the same silent majority that, was voting for UKIP back in the day to push the Conservative Party to give them an actual say over our relationship with Brussels, that silent majority will be wondering what the hell is going on with our country. Not just in our country, but across the West, actually. How can they actually stand up against this madness and reject this slide? It seems like an almost inevitable slide at the moment into the clutches of destructive Marxist ideology that's doing real damage, or attempts to do real damage, to unity in this country, by those who are seeking nothing other, as far as I can tell, than to denigrate and destroy British history and culture. Do you want to just elaborate, add a bit more, Peter, and then I'll go to Emma?
Yeah, just a little bit more there. You're absolutely right. I have to say that during this summer, when we had the protests, and then we suddenly saw, the graffiti on Churchill statue, it was the speed with which these things happened. And what I think people were shocked by was, first of all, the weakness of our institutions, which just capitulated all over. I think that was very much the case, that people, I have never known them to seem so bewildered and so upset, because they took it as a personal attack. And I would say that it's meant as a personal attack. It's an attack, if you like, on your context. It's an attack on the kind of context in which you've lived. And I think that the way that you give the people a voice is you have to ultimately give people something to vote for. That we can do everything we can, but ultimately, when it came to the referendum, and indeed when it came to pushing Brexit through the last hurdle, it required people, a party of some sort or a movement, which meant that people actually could vote for something. They could go to a rally and then they could go and put their cross next to something. And this is terribly important. This is terribly important. So in answer to your question, Dan, I would say, that is the way you give people a voice.